The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello. Today, this is the third day of the NESAW webinars in 2018. We are going to be listening to, and viewing a presentation by Bethany Bradley. She is an associate professor of biogeography and spatial ecology in the Department of Environmental Conservation at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She is interested in how geographical locations of species across landscapes and regions can inform ecological understanding of species distributions, invasion risk assessments, and conservation planning. Her research has a strong focus on terrestrial plant invasions, with a goal of understanding how invasion risk varies spatially in the context of anthropogenic disturbance and climate change. So we have about half the attendees who have registered as intending to show up to this. So we're just going to give them just a couple more minutes to let people filter in. Bethany is our only presenter for today, so we should be okay on time. And so Bethany, is there anything you'd like to mention before getting started on your presentation?
No, I don't think so. I can hold out another minute or two.
So, all right, well, it looks like we're kind of holding steady at the last minute or so. Why don't you go ahead and get started, and people will come in, and we are recording this, so any late arrivals can view the recording after it's available, and it will probably be available starting next week.
The most exciting beginning part of the presentation.
Oh, yes.
So thanks, Rebecca, for that introduction. So as Rebecca said, my name is Bethany Bradley. I'm a biogeographer by training. I work mainly on invasive plants. So you're going to see today, hopefully, some variety of taxa, but just with that acknowledgement up front that most of what I know comes from the terrestrial plant realm of things. And this is just a kind of a review presentation of what we know right now about interactions between climate change and invasive species. And so before I get started, if any of you guys are in the Northeast US, or even if you're not in the Northeast US and you're interested in keeping up with some of the activities that we've been working on in the Northeast, I'd really invite you to join our risk group, this Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management group. It's about two-year-old working group where we have been just trying to increase dialogue between scientists and managers on this kind of still new and emerging topic of how do we've been dealing with lots of invasive species problems, and now we have this additional kind of framing of how we're going to think about managing and dealing with invasive species going forward in the light of global climate change. And if you're going to be in the Northeast, a single-day conference with several speakers and working groups on Thursday, July 12th, here where I am at UMass Amherst. So this is probably preaching to the choir in terms of a starting point, but it's important when we're thinking in terms of, are my slides actually advancing over there? Hang on, I'm just double checking because I've got the
Yeah, they're not advancing on my screen.
They're not advancing?
No.
Let me try that again. I'm just going to show my main screen, and we're just going to have, this is the problem with having multiple screens, is that you can't actually, I'll just minimize all of this other stuff so that you guys can see as much of the actual PowerPoint slide. You can see that okay?
Yeah, we can see that okay.
Okay. Yeah, always tricky as to what actually gets projected. Okay, so starting point in terms of why do we care about invasive species? So you're going to see quite a few of these types of graphs today, which are from various different meta-analyses. So meta-analysis is a really important statistical tool in ecology and biology, where you take a multitude of different studies and reanalyze them all together. So that gives us these kind of ways to generalize the findings. So rather than relying on, a single study to tell us that this is the impact of an invasive species, we can look at, for example, 28 studies that have looked at the impacts of invasive aquatic species on native fish and found that amongst all of those 28 species, the effect of that impact is strongly negative. So effect size, if you have a negative effect, that basically means that whatever the question is that you're asking, are invasive aquatic species having, what kind of effect are they having on native species abundance? Strongly negative for fish, for zooplankton, for macrophytes in this particular study. So we know that invasive species are having these negative impacts in aquatic systems. We know that invasive terrestrial plants are having similar negative impacts on terrestrial plants, so a negative impact on native plant growth, abundance, diversity, fitness. All of these are showing on the negative side, but a significant negative effect on native animal abundance and native animal fitness when you have an invaded system versus an uninvaded system. So we want to take that kind of framing and say, all right, we're already dealing with the invasive species problem. What are we going to be thinking about moving forward as we add this sort of climate change additional topic on top of that? And so what I want to talk about today in terms of this outline of topics is thinking about how rising temperatures and earlier seasonality, phenology might affect how invasives interact with natives, how climate change and rain shifts will affect that interaction, climate variability, plant specifically response to rising atmospheric CO2, and then a couple of things that we know are complications to these questions. So first piece is that when we think in terms of warmer temperatures and longer growing seasons, that's virtually certain as far as the climate science stands today. The IPCC have shown that a multitude of data that by the end of this century, we will have much higher temperatures than we have today. So what does that mean for invasive species? So this is another meta-analysis. So this was an analysis of all different studies that had looked at how rising temperatures would affect the sort of performance of aquatic and terrestrial natives versus invasive species. And so when you're away from the 0 line, in this case, we have a difference. And so this circled one shows that as you increase temperature in aquatic systems, you see a significant increase in the relative performance of invasive species. We also see that as you increase temperatures, this is a different meta-analysis, a slightly more recent one focused only on terrestrial plants, that as you increase temperatures, this one suggests that the invasive plants also have a significant increase in performance relative to the native species. So in both cases here, and these are meta-analyses of lots of different studies, so the measures might vary by study, but the overall pattern is consistent, that is increasing temperatures are favoring invasive aquatic animals relative to native aquatic animals, and are favoring invasive terrestrial plants relative to native terrestrial plants. Another piece that this climate warming is likely to have an effect on the relative performance of invasives versus natives is through phenology. So this is a picture from paper from about 10 years ago. On the same date, May 30th in 1868, you can see that the tree canopy in the picture on the left doesn't have any leaves on it. May 30th, 2005, fully leafed out, right? So there's obviously plenty of variability year to year in terms of the onset of seasons, but one thing that we are seeing consistently is that in temperate systems especially, you are seeing this consistent earlier green up, earlier onset of growth amongst plants and animals. And so how does that affect invasive species? So one of the ways that it potentially affects that is through what invasion ecologists call priority effects, which is sort of like, the early bird catching the worm. If you're the first out of the gate in terms of your growth and competition relative to native species. And it has also been observed that plenty of invasive species, particularly, so me coming from the Northeast US, particularly these understory woody species woody invasive species in temperate forests, tend to be some of those first ones out of the gate. Here are just some pictorial examples of those. So for barberry, garlic mustard, honeysuckle, buckthorn, those are all examples of these woody invasive species that show this really early spring green up. So if you're the only one hanging out there early in the spring and the climate conditions are becoming even better for your faster growth, more resource availability because it's warm enough, then that gives you an additional advantage. Another piece of this is phenological plasticity. So basically this question of not only are the growing seasons getting longer, but that the variability of when the growing season starts is increasing right now through time. So, some years it's early, some years it's super early, some years it's a little late kind of thing. And if you, as a plant especially, are able to respond quickly as soon as those resources are available, as soon as the snow melts, so to speak, then you have this advantage over native species. And in fact, there was this really interesting study. This was done almost 10 years ago, or I guess over 10 years ago now. It was done out of Boston University, where they went and did a repeat survey of Concord, Massachusetts. So went throughout the entire town. And this was a repeat of a survey that was done in the late 1800s by an amateur botanist who spent over a decade surveying all of not just the presence, but also the relative abundance of flowering species within the town of Concord. And what these scientists were able to discover was that you can certainly see species that have declined. Those are all of the kind of red species on here, plenty of ones that have sort of stayed the same, the kind of white and gray ones on here, and then a few that have increased in abundance, the little blue lines on here. And they asked, well, what causes some to decline and others to increase or not change? And they found that the species who were most responsive to temperature, that is their plasticity, that phenological plasticity was high, were the ones that were likely to increase or not change. Whereas the ones that were responding primarily to cues like day length, as opposed to temperature, that didn't have really high phenological plasticity, those were the ones that showed up as red here, of having a major or a moderate decline. And what was kind of interesting then is then they took another step a little bit later and asked, well, do invasive plants have this tendency to have phenological plasticity? And it turns out that they do. That if you look at this graph, the one on the bottom says that relative to native species, invasive species were able to, over a 100-year period, shift their flowering time by 11 days or something like that on average. So where native species are kind of stuck in a rut in terms of their start of season, the invasive species are much more flexible. So just as a take-home point on that, so the invasives tend to be much more responsive to these warming temperatures, either greening up early, having more flexible phenologies, or just having a better performance than the native species do under that generally is giving them a growth advantage as well as a competitive advantage throughout the growing season. Next topic is thinking about range shifts. And the piece to think about in terms of how climate is changing right now is to know that climate change is happening super fast currently relative to any geologic paleoclimatic history that people have been able to reconstruct or record. It's happening hundreds of times faster today than it ever has in the history, certainly in the evolutionary history of species that we'd be concerned about. So given that climate change is happening super fast, and this graph on here is basically, this is an ice core record going back about 650,000 years, an ice core that was drilled by a European group in Antarctica. And basically these little squiggles on here are reconstructions of gases, atmospheric gases. So these are the three main greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So if you look at the middle one of CO2, sort of red along here, you can see it, going up slightly in interglacial periods and then going down during glaciated periods down to the last glaciation and then up to our interglacial. And then this red line that's basically going straight up is today's record that are causing current climate change. And you'll notice that you don't see any spikes, anything close to that straight up. And this is even current to probably 10 years ago. We're now well over 400 in terms of CO2 parts per million. So super fast rise. And so then we can ask, okay, well, can native species keep up with this, right? How fast are native species moving? And this was a study from also about 10 years ago that was done in the Green Mountains of southern Vermont, where in 1964, the Forest Service did a series of transects measuring tree composition up in elevation along the Green Mountains. 2004, they went back and repeated this study. And they found that, as you might expect, in response to warming temperatures, the northern hardwoods, which had been at lower elevation, were expanding upwards, and the boreal forests, which had been at the high elevations and still are contracting from those lower elevations as they're getting too warm. But they were able to put an estimate on this of about how much these forests are moving, and obviously they're trees. We're not expecting them to uproot and jog uphill or anything like that, but it gives us a sense of, okay, over 40 years, these trees on average, the forests were shifting by about 600 feet upwards in elevation. So how fast is that? Well, that's not very fast relative to current climate change. In contrast, if you look at the other main form of dispersal, right? If we don't just say like, okay, tree, move uphill on your own, but instead recognize that we as humans are moving species all over the place, then these species that we're likely to introduce outside of their quote unquote native ranges, those are the ones that are likely to have a much bigger advantage because they're already there. They've already been put in these climates that are slightly cooler than their native range, where they might have wanted to expand, but on their own might not have made it there. This was a neat study in Europe where this particular species, so it's a flowering plant from Europe, and the red on here on the graph on the left is basically the native range, reconstructed native range of that plant. And these little green dots that are all over here, including, way up north, those are nurseries that are selling that plant across Europe. And so presumably if a nursery is selling it, then homeowners are planting it someplace nearby. So we have created this huge advantage for this particular species, as well as a huge array of other plants that we like to plant outside of their native ranges. And so just as a reminder that it's not only ornamental, benign, non-native plants that we're talking about here, we're also talking about invasive plants and invasive animals that get introduced along the same pathway. So the majority of invasive plants have been introduced. This is invasive plants from the US specifically, of about 1,100 invasive plants, almost 60% specifically associated with the deliberate introduction pathway, and the vast majority of that was through the ornamental plant trade. Similarly, if we talk about invasive animals, so how do invasive fish get from one pond to the next? Mostly because we're stocking them there, sometimes because we're releasing them from an aquarium or pet trade or some sort of bait, but for the most part, it's because we put them there. And so what that means is that we have this huge advantage for both non-native and invasive species that we have chosen to distribute across landscapes and regions. So we think, as biologists, many of us think about dispersal in terms of, oh, well, how far is the wind going to blow that seed, or how far is the bird going to take that seed? But hey, if you're planting bamboo in your backyard, or your boat is covered in hydrilla or some other aquatic plant, then that's going to be a much more important and long distance dispersal mechanism than the wind or the birds. So we are the source of dispersal for the species that are going to have the greatest advantage as climate change alters their potential ranges. And this is just another point along those lines. Are we dispersing the plants themselves, but we're also dispersing a lot of pests and pathogens that might be hitching a ride on a lot of those plants. Most plants are arriving on live plants, insects, mites, diseases, etc. In terms of climate warming, so climate warming not only favors these more broadly dispersed species, but it also favors pests specifically, and that's because most pests are ectotherms, so that is, they're relying on the environment rather than on their internal organs to produce the heat that they need. And so generally, if you look at warmer climates, there are more insects in warmer climates than there are in cooler climates. And so as temperature warms, we can expect an increase in populations of a variety of different insect pests. And then just another piece on that is that not only do you expect more variety of insect pests, but you also can anticipate a longer life cycle associated, both longer as well as multiple life cycles associated with that warming. That's one of the concerns. Now, this is a native pest, but with the mountain pine beetle outbreaks in the western US, where the insects have longer to do damage, and then can also have multiple generations within a single growing season, where prior to this degree of warming that we're currently experiencing, they weren't able to do that. And then we've also got plenty of models, projections of where species might expand to. So there are a number of invasive species that are already on the move, both because we've helped disperse them, but also because they're able to, hitch a ride in our cars and various other accidental vectors. This is just one example of kudzu invasion. So kudzu, right, big hotspot as far as the invasion extent goes in the southeast US, where all of these kind of red areas are. And all the hash marks on this map are basically the expansion or the potential expansion of that species by 2100, so out to the end of this century. And then the colors underneath those hashed areas are basically the likelihood that it could persist there. So if you've got red under a hash mark, those are the high risk areas where this species might expand into. And we've done some ongoing work with that kind of question of where are species and ranges likely to shift. And this is just a single figure from a paper from a couple of years ago looking at hotspots, or trying to identify hotspots of future plant invasion. And there is a big, in the eastern temperate forests especially, lots of different species currently, but definitely the sort of potential for a shift of those variety of species northwards into the upper Midwest, New York and New England. What's actually kind of interesting about this, though, is that because we're seeing these shifts, it actually gives us a kind of novel opportunity to identify invasive species that might arrive before they arrive. So where current, like current invasion practice, a lot of times we're on the lookout for, any new species or, maybe a couple of species that have been identified as high priority because they're super problematic someplace else. But with climate change, we actually have lists. We know what kind of species are really problematic in states or regions that are in slightly warmer climates than we currently are. And so we can start working on not only, I can go back to the previous one, not only the location of where this hotspot of risk is, but the actual specific species that are likely to be shifting from, talking about my home state, so shifting from, the tri-state area, something like that, up into Massachusetts, we can say, here's the list of species. And ongoing work of what we've been doing in my lab is working on impacts prioritization of those range shifting species. So we've been saying, okay, we can generate a watch list of, 50 species that are likely to get to Massachusetts by 2050 that aren't here now. And now we want to know, okay, of those 50 species, what are the ones we should put at a high priority for monitoring and management because they have the biggest impacts in other regions. All right, so take home point is that species ranges are shifting, but invasive species especially, but any species that we're cultivating or releasing, those ones are going to have an enormous advantage because climate change is happening super fast. And so the species that can move super fast are going to have the best chance moving forward. I don't think I had I think I'm going to say this at the end, but the real take home there in terms of management or in terms of talking to folks is to really push people to be planting locally, to not be, releasing pets. I know you guys have probably doing all this stuff already, but this is like another argument for planting local because the more we're planting local, the more advantage we're giving to our native species and the less of an advantage we're giving to non-native and to invasive species. Okay, so next piece is to think about climate change in terms of disturbance. So this is a graph that's just dealing with heavy rainfall events. You can find the same types of data and patterns for extreme droughts, for heat waves, for the magnitude of hurricanes, for example, have all been increasing with time and with climate warming. So down in the lower left of this graph is just the overall trend for the US. And so these are extreme, and I forget exactly how they characterized extreme, but it's like 2 days of really heavy rainfall that historically only happened, like once every 10 years or something like that, happening more and more frequently. And you can see that break down into various different regions. So some, like the Southwest that just doesn't have a whole lot of rainfall, we're not seeing as much of that pattern, but everywhere else we consistently are. So what does climate variability or these kind of extreme events do? Well, the main thing they do is to create a disturbance. And we know from tons of studies in invasion ecology that disturbance facilitates invasion, that as you have weedier species, they tend to be really good at taking advantage of, sudden increases in light availability or sudden, novel resources, lack of competition kind of thing from others. Case in point of this picture of kudzu at a disturbed forest edge, and then just a graph from a 2009 paper for garlic mustard. In this case, as you increase the availability of seeds as well as the disturbance of a site, you get this huge increase in the density of garlic mustard on those sites. The other thing that's happening, though, is not only do weedier species thrive with increased climate disturbance, but native species do a lot worse with these larger climate disturbances. So we've seen, and this is an example for forests, Forest tree mortality has increased with these increasing extreme heat and extreme drought stress events. So climate change in terms of this variability is doing two things. It's potentially facilitating the invasive species, as well as potentially suppressing the native species. And so here's just an example of a graph from looking at tree canopy cover and understory plants following Hurricane Katrina. So in 2006, so tree canopy cover up until Katrina was, around 80%, dropped rapidly after that point, and has recovered since then. So this is a 2011 paper, and I don't actually know what the kind of long-term results at this study site were. But what they found, at least on the short term, was that, as you knock off canopy cover, then you get a whole bunch of understory growth. And in this particular example, almost all of that understory growth was associated with invasive species, not associated with native species. So this question of, as you have these extreme events, do these understory invasives impede what would ordinarily be normal forest succession? I don't know that we know, or I don't know the answer to that. The disturbance is that the climate variability is creating a novel disturbance, whether that's increased heat waves, increased droughts, increased extreme rainfall events. All of those things are predicted to happen in some regions, so you could have both more drought as well as more extreme wet events. That sort of peakiness of the hydrologic cycle of the precipitation is one of the main projections of future climate change. So climate variability creates that novel disturbance that does two things. It harms native species, knocks them back a bit, and then potentially facilitates these kind of weedier invasive species. Last point that I want to talk about is atmospheric CO2 and its relationship to invasive versus native plants. So atmospheric CO2 levels are rising. You saw that graph from the Antarctic ice core that went back 650,000 years. This one goes back 60 years or thereabouts, but this is atmospheric CO2 measured at the top of Mauna Loa Volcano Observatory on the Big Island of Hawaii. And going right on up, we are past 400 at this point, well past 400 in 2018. And so carbon dioxide, as we remember from graphs like this one from 5th grade biology or whatever, is a main resource for plants, right? Plants need CO2 and water and light in order to photosynthesize. And so it is true that generally, if you look at how well do plants do under higher CO2, that you find that plants do better. They grow faster, they have more flowers, more fruits, greater seed mass, etc. And so if we didn't know anything more than that, we might think, like maybe plants, maybe everybody wins with higher CO2, greening of the earth, right? And the problem is that if you do a comparative study of how well do invasive plants do relative to native plants, we find pretty consistently that invasive plants win, that invasive plants outperform native plants under elevated CO2. And this is, again, from another meta-analysis looking at elevated CO2. So the red here is our invasive plants, the blue are native plants, and the little star means that there's a significant difference between those two effect size estimates. Both of them, you'll notice, are on the positive side, so they're both positively affected by elevated CO2, but the invasive plants much better than the native plant. The other problem with that is not only are the invasive plants doing better, but as they get bigger, they become harder to kill. So this was a really nice study by Lou Ziska a number of years ago, looking at the comparison for Canada thistle under ambient CO2 versus elevated CO2. And these two plots were ones where they applied the sort of recommended amount of herbicide to both of those two plots. And you can see under ambient CO2, herbicide was fairly effective, except for this guy in the back who is a badass or something. But under future CO2, those recommended herbicide levels were not effective for controlling this plant. And they delved into a little bit of the mechanism of that and found that it was because these invasive plants were able to put much more of their resources into growth below ground. So they had just like monster roots. And so even applying the recommended herbicide amounts didn't get down to actually kill the roots of those plants, and they were able to come back and recover. So a couple of things to be thinking about in terms of CO2 interactions with invasive plants. Outside of the plant world, if we look at other invasives and CO2, so in the aquatic world, so the invasive plants tend to perform better under rising CO2. So the gray triangles on here are the invasives in this study. So this is aquatic. The one in the middle is aquatic. The one on the right is terrestrial. And so this little star up here indicates that there's a significant difference between terrestrial CO2, terrestrial invasives and native plants with elevated CO2. The one over here is not significant, so the aquatic increase in CO2, but what you do see is that as you add CO2, so as you make aquatic and marine systems more acidic, you see much lower performance of the native species relative to the non-natives. So you're seeing something similar here that we were just talking about in terms of disturbance, that on the one hand, some invasive species. On the other hand, the increase in CO2 suppresses some native species, especially native animals in aquatic and marine systems. And so either way, regardless of whether you're giving an advantage to invasives or you're giving a disadvantage to natives, that works out to the same effect, which is that your invasive plants and animals tend to perform better. And then just to throw in a non-invasive per se story, but a native winner with rising CO2. So this was a great study from a dozen or so years ago where they were doing actually forest experiments in the Southeast in a free air CO2 exchange experiment. So they were looking at how forests are responding to higher CO2 and started observing that, gosh, there's a lot of poison ivy growing around here. And set out to do this study where they found, yeah, there was a lot more poison ivy growing under higher CO2. And not only that, but adding insult to injury, it was more allergenic as well. So, so you have to kind of pity the folks who do long-term work in those forest CO2 rise sites because they're itchy. So take-home point in terms of rising CO2, that we can expect higher CO2, but the relative effect really matters. And so we should be watching out for hardier invasive plants, especially, and for a relative improvement in our aquatic animals, in the aquatic invasive animals, just because native aquatic species are getting hit hard by increasing CO2. And then the last piece that I wanted to talk about was some of the known unknowns of this system. So I put this figure up, so this is dealing with sort of forests and soils and climate and stuff like that, just to make the point that there are a lot of arrows in this graph. This is true on terrestrial systems. Here's kind of an equivalent one for aquatic systems, lots of arrows going on in terms of stuff that's connected and things that we don't necessarily know. So we don't know how all of these different things are interacting. Most studies that we do, you know, might focus on one of these arrows or one connection. And so it just takes a fair bit of time, and sometimes it takes having a real world, you know, experiment play out of having some surprises before we really figure out all of the connections that are going on here. And so what that means is that it just makes it harder to predict exactly what's going to happen at any given site. We can use these kind of general themes and meta-analyses that show us generalizable directions. Those can be used to guide, but we're never going to know all of the pieces of any specific site. Another piece that's unknown is what's happening next, right? We know that we are constantly importing new goods, and those goods are often including, things like stowaway insects or pests. We are constantly importing new plants, and those new plants have a risk, some of them, of becoming invasive. And so this point is just to make that the red part of this graph is super high risk when you're starting to import new species or from a totally new market or something like that. If you're importing ornamental plants, for example, because you don't know anything about most of those plants, but that risk continues. The risk of new invasive species arriving and being introduced continues, because as you keep trying and trying again with those same species, eventually you might get the right conditions for one of them to take. And we know that there are lots of different countries that and now the study is from 5 or 6 years ago, but the pattern is likely holds true to today, that all of these red ones on here are countries that were relatively new to the scene in terms of us in the US importing new nursery plants from those places. And we know that nursery plants are the main source of invasive plants that go on to become invasive, but we also know that they're a primary source of a variety of different insect pests and pathogens. So these imports from other countries are high on the high risk location, but we, because they're all so new, we really don't have a good handle on what those species might actually be. And so from that perspective, as well as from that perspective of thinking about dispersal and how dispersal provides an advantage relative to climate change, a big direction to go in and to encourage your stakeholders to go in is to think more about planting local. So these are a couple of examples of local, nurseries and whatnot that focus on native plants in the Northeast, except for the one in the center, is a more national website that you can go and find your state, find different organizations that sell or focus on native plants, which, we're all thinking about invasive species, but the counter to that is thinking about all of those native communities and how do we support native communities under climate change. And one of the things that native species are going to need if they're going to keep up with climate change is help, is landowners, gardeners, whatever, thinking in terms of, hey, this species isn't from, my backyard, but it's from the backyard a couple of states away. Let me see if I can, I'll be the forefront of assisted migration or whatever we're calling it today in science. All right, so just to finish up, with the conclusions are that we know that from these meta-analyses that invasives tend to have more positive response to warming temperatures than native species. That's true for aquatics, that's true for terrestrial plants. We also know that warming temperature increases the length of the growing season and favors species that are able to grow earlier and have more plasticity in terms of the timing of their green up, and that those species that are able to do that tend to be invasive. We know that species ranges are shifting and that species ranges will have to shift very quickly in the context of climate change because climate is warming very, very fast. But anything that we're cultivating is going to have a head that needs to happen if these species are going to keep up with climate change. And so if the majority of the species that we're cultivating and moving around are invasive, then those are the ones that are going to have the advantage. If instead the majority of the species that we're moving around are native, then the invasives might have less of an advantage. We know that climate variability creates a novel disturbance, and that disturbance is closely tied to weediness, to invasiveness, especially of in plant communities. And then last thing, we know that invasive plants have the strong growth advantage relative to native plants as you increase atmospheric CO2. And I'll just leave it with the risk slide that I think I missed earlier on because I wasn't figuring out how my slides worked. So thanks very much.
So we have a few questions in the questions pane. You can add additional questions as you have them. So I'll start with some of the questions that have already been asked. Currently, Peter asked if the slides will be available. So I know that the presentations are being recorded, and so you can review the presentations as they're added to the NESAW website and to the National EPSI website. But Bethany, are you planning on posting these slides anywhere?
I'm trying to think if I have them posted someplace. I can post them anywhere. Do you guys have a location where we can put them?
Well, actually, Bugwood has a website, of course, called Bugwood Presents, and anybody can, load presentations onto Bugwood Presents. That way, it's an easy sharing option. People can go there, download the presentations, and use any of the slides if they're interested in it, or just view the slides if they want to view the slides at a later date. So I can send you some information if you'd like.
That sounds great. I'll plan to do that. And I don't have my email address on here, but I'm pretty easy to find on Google. So if anybody can't find it and wants these, feel free to email me. I can send them.
Okay, and so for the audience, the Bugwood Presents, if you just type Bugwood Presents into Google, you'll come across it, and you can search through the database and find presentations you're interested in viewing or downloading. So Ryan asked, do you know of any studies looking at the distribution of invasive species along long-distance migratory bird routes?
I don't, but I also don't work on birds. I know that there have been a number of studies looking at aquatic plants and other aquatic species that get dispersed on bird feet, but beyond that, I don't really know. Yeah, I don't know much about birds.
Well, I've heard a fair amount of birds eating fruit and seeds and so forth. But yeah, I don't know. I don't either know specifically like how far it travels, from time of ingestion to, or what species are being looked at along migratory bird routes. So that would be an interesting thing to look up at some point.
For sure.
Yeah. So Lynn asked, is there any region-wide plan for deer control, as they seem to have a very detrimental impact on any efforts to grow natives? They are gobbling up most of the investment.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. That's above my pay grade. I mean, I just do the research side of things, so so I don't know what different states have been trying to do. Yeah,
Yeah.
I hear you.
No, I understand as well. My mom constantly complains about the deer eating her pansies and pretty much anything else she plants. So
Yeah.
I know that there are, I don't know about cities, municipalities, townships. They all have had their different plans. I don't know about any broad region-wide plan. So that would have to be something you'd look up in your general area to figure out what might be going on.
Mm-hmm.
So Caitlin Jones, who's no longer in the as an attendee, she said, "Wonderful presentation, thank you." Todd Bowler, great information, thank you. Jessica asked, "Can a list of Bethany's literature citations please be added to the presentation that is posted?" So do you think you could add a slide or two of just citations or
Oh yes,
references?
from those different papers.
Yeah.
Yep, sure. I've got all of the brief citations, so I
Yeah.
should be able to put that to the end. Yep.
Okay. That'd be great because I was looking at some of them like, oh, I want to read that paper. So, Katie asked what was the website for recorded presentations. From what I understand, they will be added to the NESAW website as well as the National EPSI websites. So those should be on both of those websites. Matt asked, there's a question at the end of that. There is probably a correlation between plant plasticity and stress, so plants with higher plasticity are likely to suffer less stress, and this may translate to increased ability to fend off herbivores, pathogens, and competitors. This would probably tend to further shift the competitive advantage. Does this make sense, or is the relationship between plasticity and stress more complex?
That's a super good question. So I don't know about plasticity and stress per se, and that's getting into kind of community ecology stuff, which is pretty far afield from things that I know about. But I know that I do know that the plasticity questions, or the sort of phenological traits, have been correlated with other traits. So I think what he said about stress is sort of similar in this to, plants that are able to regrow quickly, or plants that, because if one of your strategies is to green up really early before everybody else, then the trade-off to that is you're likely to get hit by a frost, or you might get, munched by the first, deer that wanders by, or something like that. And so you have to have traits, you have to have other strategies to be able to bounce back from that. And so things like growth rate and height, I think those are the ones that's come to mind, have been correlated with phenological plasticity.
Okay. Jessica asked, "It seems like there is overall consensus that climate change will exacerbate invasive species challenges. Are municipalities or states including this research in their budgeting? And are they working more to prevent incoming introduction, or are they more focused on containing the growth of existing infestations in their areas?"
No, that's a super great question. So part of what we've been working on with risk is to start that dialogue of what kinds of management topics especially need to be rising to the top of the many things that we're thinking about and worrying about. And we're actually, yeah, it's funny, like earlier today, we're working on trying to finish up a survey to ask our, Northeast managers about that exact question of, how much time is spent monitoring for new species versus managing existing infestations. Because certainly if we're thinking in terms of climate change, we're going to be thinking about, changing populations of existing ones to a degree, but it's the new emerging ones that, in my mind, rise to the top in terms of things we should be concerned about. So my experience in the Northeast, and I guess this would be mainly New York and Massachusetts states managers, is that most people haven't really been, got enough to deal with in terms of invasive species, and so they're interested in learning about, thinking about invasive species plus climate change, but aren't necessarily implementing anything related to those yet. But for New York, at least, and New York is pretty progressive as far as having a variety of invasive species programs and support for invasive species work. I know that some of the New York calls are priority lists at least have started putting climate change into the thinking about invasive species management.
Yeah, and I know that in some of the other regions with the groups I've worked with out there, a lot of them will have kind of tiered lists of invasive species or noxious species, and they'll have I guess taking maybe Utah as an example, they'll have these are what we're just trying to contain, these are what we're trying to actually be able to control and potentially eradicate someday, and then these are the species that we are looking out for or are early detection species. So it'll probably vary by by place and by budget, but I think pretty much everyone has at least an eye out there somewhere for what's on the horizon, what might be coming, but the majority of what they will be doing is what they can do in terms of, we have this problem now.
Well, and that's a good point too, Rebecca, that it's not, right now from my experience is a little limited in the Northeast, but most of the states in the Northeast seem to be doing is, consulting experts and doing, reviewing literature and stuff in their state relative to what species would be put on the, priority lists. They're not necessarily talking to, Massachusetts advisory group is not necessarily talking to the Connecticut, Invasive Species Council to try to cross state borders and find out what the slightly warmer places are dealing with right now. And that, I think, is a really key piece in terms of developing those watch lists and putting putting more species that we're really going to be concerned about on the keep an eye out for these list.
Yeah, and I imagine that's especially going to be an issue with, say, those established species that have kind of potentially reached their current range due to climate or some other climate related factor. And so some of the nearby groups that work in invasive species may not have those on their radar, even though they've kind of been knocking on their door. They kind of feel maybe safe at the moment, but that definitely will change with climate change.
Sounds like a plot of a horror movie that you're outlining right now. Feeling safe right now.
I know my next career then. So, Lynn, she's the one who asked about the deer. She said, not surprising that they seem to prefer natives, and thank you. So, are there any other additional questions? Rodrigo Diaz said, awesome presentation. I enjoyed the quality of information. We got job security, which is unfortunately true. So again, these presentations, today's as well as tomorrow's and the previous 2 days presentations will be available on the NESAW as well as the National EPSI websites. They're not being posted daily. They'll likely be posted either at the end of the week or at the beginning of next week. And Bethany has graciously offered to add her slides to the Bugwood Presents database, and you can go to that database and search for her or the name of her presentation, and you'll be able to find it as soon as she's able to add it, and adding in some of the literature cited information she had throughout her presentation. So I just want to thank someone asked what presentation is tomorrow. So tomorrow will be the Troy Hinkle. He'll be talking about the Indiana SISMA project, and that will happen at 3 p.m. tomorrow. So it's Bugwood. Someone asked what the website, BUG as in insects, wood as in, well, trees. And it's one word, and that's we're the group that is currently serving as moderators for these presentations. So again, I want to thank everyone for showing up. We had what I would say is very good attendance, and you can of course spread the word about the videos being available to anybody for later viewing. So I want to thank Bethany for taking time out of her schedule to inform everyone on this very important topic.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Yep. All right. You guys have a good day, and we'll hopefully see you tomorrow.
Rebecca, do you need anything else from me, or shall I sign off too?
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.